Good evening. It's good to see each and every one of you that chose to be with us tonight for our midweek Bible study. If you're tuning in virtually, thank you for being with us in that capacity. You are in the adult class. We've been over the last few weeks looking at a topical lesson on the subject matter of heaven and hell. We started by noting their chronologically not happening at the moment prior to our death. And so we talked about this intermediate state and the basic chronology of the Lord's return, followed by the judgment, and then our being ushered into either heaven or hell at that point. And so we've talked about that over the last several weeks. We got the PowerPoint started. We were looking most recently at heaven, and I titled the part we looked at as My Father's House, as I offered just some introductory material about heaven. And so we've looked at some of that over the course of several weeks. And then we just barely got started and introduced this, similar concept of the, quote, new heaven and new earth. And we'll discuss that briefly, and then briefly look at a description that we find in Revelation 21 and talk about that a bit. And then we'll move on to, a subtopic within this overall theme that was actually requested. When we began this series a few weeks ago, someone asked me, can you mention this or explain this when you talk about heaven and hell? And I'll just leave you on the edge of your seat, and we'll get there in just a minute. But let's talk about this new heaven and this new earth. We find this statement on a couple of noteworthy occasions. First, we might think about 2 Peter 3 and verse 13. There we read, "Nevertheless, we, according to his promise, look for new heavens and a new earth in which the righteous dwell." And then we have a very similar statement that we have looked at relatively recently when we did our series on the book of Revelation. And it's Revelation 21 and verse 1. John has a vision in these series of visions, and he said, "Now I saw a new heaven and a new earth." And that is what we're kind of zeroing in on. Now, if we were to take the time, and we will in just a minute, we could drop down to verse 9 in Revelation 21 and see a description. And that's what we'll spend a little bit of time. I really am going to kind of just gloss over it. But before we do, we might ask, what about the old one? Now, if you're in Revelation 21 and verse 1, where we just read, you'll notice I didn't finish reading the sentence. "Now I saw a new heaven and a new earth, for the first heaven and the first earth had passed away." Passed away. Let's talk about that for just a moment. Can I get a volunteer to read for us Genesis 8 and verse 22? While the earth remains. There seems to be an implication there. In other words, as long as the earth is here, the earth will experience time for seed planting, time for a harvest, the various things that are cyclical, like the seasons, and the implication is it will remain for a period of time. But apart from that simple implication, there's express details about God's plan for the earth. And if we look in 2 Peter in chapter 3, of course we already mentioned it in Revelation 21 and verse 1, Peter says, "But the day of the Lord will come as a thief in the night, in which the heavens will pass away with a great noise, and the elements will melt with a fervent heat. Both the earth and the works that are in it will be burned up." There's the fate. What is the fate of the earth, the world, and the works in it? When the Lord returns. Again, it's that day of the Lord, or on that day, or when the Lord returns, or when the end is ushered in. Those cluster of events we described a few weeks ago when we looked at the Lord's return, the bodily resurrection, and we looked at the judgment, and then ultimately going to heaven or hell. All right. Matthew chapter 24, Jesus said that, the same basic thing. The heavens and the earth will be destroyed, will be gone, will end, will be burned up, or to use the other term, will die or no longer be. But in the context of what Jesus was saying, there is something that is eternal in its nature and duration, and that's the Word of God. But the earth, the physical world and realm that we occupy and know, it will be destroyed. There'll be no longer a need for it. In fact, we mentioned there's no longer a need for death in Hades, the Hadean realm. There's no longer a need for them. And so John sees in this vision and describes for us the end of the devil and the end of the earth and all of these things being consumed. Of course, the devil has a place prepared for him and his angels, and we'll talk a lot about that in the subsequent weeks. So, the statement, new heaven, new earth, the old one will be destroyed, burned up. Okay. Now, there are some well-intended people that will come and knock on your door, and they will like to discuss the Bible with you. And one of the things they like to do is go to the Old Testament, point to a handful of verses, and then present a notion of the earth being restored and for us living here on the earth. And if they come to your door and talk to you about this, they'll go to these three passages, or at least that's been my experience. They'll go to one of these three passages, or all three of them if you'll entertain them. Will somebody read these for us quickly? Will somebody read Psalm 78, verse 69? And then somebody else be prepared to read the 104th Psalm in verse 5.
And he built his sanctuary like the heights, like the earth which he has established forever.
Okay, so he's established the earth forever. All right, let's look at Psalm 104 and verse 5 quickly. So here's this term forever associated with the earth that he created. All right, so he created the earth and he was going to have it around forever. It's going to exist forever. Now, don't worry about that, Genesis 8 passage we looked at, because we might be implying too much there. Okay, but one more. Ecclesiastes 1 and verse 4. Who will read that for us?
One generation passes away and another generation comes, but the earth abides forever.
Now this one's the easiest. Well, you've read the book of Ecclesiastes. It's rightfully placed in the poetry literature. It is using allegories and metaphors. It's making points. The point that he's making is very obvious. There's this repetitive, I should say, emphasis on life under the sun. And what he's saying is, and the context is, one generation rises up and then they die, and the next generation of people rises up, but the earth's still the same. In other words, 100 years from now, none of us will be here, except maybe the baby. None of us will be here in 100 years, but the earth will still be here. And that's the only point he's making in Ecclesiastes 1 and verse 4. We're all going to die in 100 years, and there'll be a whole other crop of humans on the earth, but the earth's still going to be here. That's all he's saying there. Now, the other occasions that are mentioned here in Psalm 78 and Psalm 104, and there are a couple of others, but these are the most common. What's he mentioning? Well, he uses this term forever. Now, has he ever used that term before in any other thing that we might know of that didn't actually mean forever? In other words, he was talking about this perpetual existence of something, the earth. Now, either we have a contradiction and a problem with what Peter and John is explaining for us and elsewhere about the earth being destroyed, or even Jesus saying the heaven and earth will pass away or be destroyed or die, but the word won't. So either we completely misunderstand that, or there's another simpler explanation to this point. And interestingly enough, the only references that are ever appealed to are in the poetry literature, what's categorized as poetry literature. And there are other similarities. For example, it's said that the Passover will be observed forever. All right. Any of you observe the Passover by the parameters that are set in the Old Testament? No. Was that the intention of this type of language that was used for example, and I'm not exhausting the subject, but for something like the celebrating of the Passover or the priesthood? It said in Numbers chapter 25 and verse 13 that the priesthood, that the Aaron priesthood, the Levitical priesthood, would be forever. All right? Is that true? Well, we read Hebrews 7. We've studied the book of Hebrews. Hebrews 7 says right the opposite. No. There is not a perpetual priesthood of Aaron and Levi. No, he's using terminology to say that this is a perpetual promise as part of our covenant relationship, that I will forever have you keep this holy and have this particular office in the priesthood. But of course we know that there was a new covenant and those things were old and void. And so either we understand this forever to mean something entirely more concrete, or we have a conflict. And so when he uses this terminology, he's meaning it's a perpetual generation after generation thing. But like the old observances and the old priesthood, they were done away with. And we're told that. We're also told the earth's going to be done away with. That's sufficient. All right, any questions about that before we move on a tab? So what is this new heaven and this new earth? Well, the old one will be destroyed, the physical universe that we know, and we'll have a new heaven and a new earth. Or, you know another way to say that? A new dwelling place, or a new place to dwell. Our hope and our inheritance are told to be in a specific place. Here's just a couple of examples. In heaven. In heaven. Not here on the earth. But there are other lines of reasoning that we appreciate far more. If you have your Bible, go over with me to the book of Matthew. So in heaven and not on earth is our hope and our inheritance. If we go to Matthew chapter 5, let's read some familiar verses rather quickly. Look at Matthew chapter 5. Note verse 12 there. Rejoice and be exceedingly glad, for great is your reward in heaven. Well, we could think of other verses that are probably likely as familiar to us. Look at look at Matthew 19 and verse 21. Matthew 19:21. Jesus said to him, he's speaking to the rich young ruler, if you want to be perfect, go, sell all that you have and give to the poor, and you will have treasure in heaven. And come and follow me. But here's the one that we probably know the best. Look at Matthew chapter 6. Drop down to verse 19. Here Jesus says, do not lay up for yourself treasures on earth. Now, if I put that in concert with what Peter said, I don't know why, right? 2 Peter 3 and verse 10. For the day of the Lord will come as a thief in the night, and the heavens and the earth will pass away, to be destroyed. The earth and the works that are in it will be burned up. So why would you put your treasures there? But he also gives us some other information that's pertinent to this notion of storing your treasures on earth. Do not lay up for yourself treasures on earth where moth and rust can destroy, and where a thief can break in and steal. But lay up for yourself treasures in heaven, where neither moth nor rust can destroy, or thief can break in and steal. For where your treasure is, there your heart is also. It's not on the earth. When it says a new heaven and a new earth, it's talking about a new place to dwell. A new city, if you will, whose builder and maker is God. That's what the patriarchs waited for, Hebrews 11. It's not describing this terrestrial place. And even in the description of it that we'll look at, there's no sun, there's no moon, there's no days. It's not the earth just rejuvenated and a physical reign here in this, I don't know the terminology, dimension of what we know as our galaxy and our solar system. Okay, but I think some of that we'll look at when we look at these particulars. All right, let me pause. Questions, comments, thoughts? Maybe you're saving your comments for the description. Let's go over to Revelation chapter 21, and I want to do this quickly. I don't intend to spend a great deal of time with this. Many of you remember we studied the book of Revelation in a series of lessons on Sunday night for quite a number of months, actually. I don't remember exactly how long, but it was a long time. And I mentioned in this section, without looking at the particulars very much at all, that I think the point of Revelation chapter 21, starting in verse 9 with this description of the New Jerusalem or the new heaven and the new earth, is that, number one, it's really, really big. Number two, it's really, really beautiful. And I think that's the point. And like we mentioned when we studied the book over and over again, it is a vision. And it is difficult for us to be able to ascertain the minutiae of the details of this vision and interpret them all properly. But they have an overall point. Each of the visions has an overall point. And I think the overall point of this is it's big and it's beautiful. But are we to literally extrapolate from this description that this is precisely what it looks like, or that the dimensions have some type of, I guess, ramification physically? All right, let's talk about it for just a second. The description we find is in Revelation chapter 21, starts in verse 9, of what John saw starting in Revelation 21 and 1. I saw a new heaven and a new earth, for the old ones have been destroyed or passed away or died. I'd like to ask for a volunteer to read for us Isaiah 40 and verse 18 before we even go any further. Isaiah 40, verse 18. Will somebody read that for us? To whom will you liken God, or to what would you compare God? And the point is in the context of idolatry. Why would you make an idol that doesn't compare? How could you possibly get something and think it compared to God? Or with what will I liken God to? You know, God's like this, you know. Of course, you might say, well, we have descriptions in the Scripture that God is love. Okay, sure. But the point that he's making is, what in the world would you liken or compare God to? And I think we can say the same of heaven. What do we really liken or compare it to? Well, the best we got. And that's what John did in this vision. And so we see the first thing he describes is the light there. And this is something we've talked about probably as much as any. That there's no moon, there's no sun, there's no day as we would understand or appreciate it as we rotate around the sun. And we don't have those particulars. In fact, the light source is described as God himself. There's no need of any external light source, but it's God. The glory of his brightness is what illuminates the new heaven and the new earth, or the city whose builder and maker is God. Okay. The wall that's described, or the wall of the city, as it's stated in verse 14. Let's look at a couple of verses here ever so quickly. Drop down to verse 17. Then he measured its wall, 144 cubits, according to the measure of the man, that is, of an angel. And so this angel gives him a reed and has him measure the particulars of the new heaven and the new earth that's seen in John's vision. Now, some will suggest that this is actually, giving us a description literally of what heaven is. And so he uses this description, for example, of its size. Now, let me talk a little bit about that. That's 218 feet. That's noteworthy. It doesn't say, interestingly enough, as we read down through here, it just says 144 cubits. And we know the measure of a cubit is roughly 18 inches, and we can do the arithmetic, and it's roughly 218 feet. Well, it goes on to say the construction of this wall was of certain precious stones, gems, or in this particular case, it mentions some of them. Jasper. Goes on to say the foundation of the wall of the city were adorned with all kind of precious stones, and then it lists some: jasper and sapphire, emeralds, and so forth. Interestingly enough, those same particular stones are mentioned on the breastplate of the high priest in Exodus 28. They were to be adorned in that fashion. And then we see in John's vision these same precious metals, precious stones or jewels adorning the wall. That's 218 feet. Now, it doesn't say in the text whether it's thick or high. I think it's high, but I don't know. Again, we're not told. 218 feet is what we're told. What's 218 feet to you? Well, I don't know. I tried to think, what would it be to me? And I thought, stories is helpful. You ever gone on an elevator, stayed on the 7th floor, the 8th floor, the 9th floor? Well, this would be about the 21st floor. So it's describing a wall, I believe, in its height, but some would argue he may be meaning its width. But it's 20 some odd stories, 21 stories high. I don't like heights. I can get to about the 7th floor and look over and go, I'm good with that. So, I mean, it's significantly high. Now, I don't know. And it's made of all these jewels, and that's the wall. The gates are mentioned. You've heard all your life, haven't you? The pearly gates. Haven't you heard that? Now, where does that come from? Well, obviously, it comes from here. Now, if we read down and we drop down to verse 21, the 12 gates were 12 pearls. Each individual gate was of one pearl. And then, of course, let me go back to the layout. We'll mention that in a minute. But then we get the street here in this same verse. The street, it is singular, although there's been effort made to suggest there might be more than one street. But it is singular in the original language. And the street is of pure gold. Now, again, are we thinking that this is a literal place and these are the literal dimensions and these are the literal things that we'll see when we get there? I don't know. I won't be disappointed if they are. I mean, I don't know that John is trying to describe the presence of God and the surroundings. And he's seeing what he's seeing. Representative or literal, like I said, if it's literal, I'm not too upset about it, I guess, or concerned. But look at verse 16. We'll see the layout of this city. The city is laid out as a square. Its length is as great as its breadth. And he measured the city with a reed. 12,000 furlongs. Its length, breadth, and height are equal. What's that mean? Well, that means it's a cube. Well, essentially. I mean, if it's got the same dimensions of its length, its width, and going up, then it's making a cube. And if we take the measurement here, that I know we all measure things in furlongs. I mean, you know, I know, Dan, you're in construction. Don't you do furlongs all the time? Every time y'all build something, you know, a furlong here and a couple furlongs there. But what it equates to is roughly about 1/8 of a mile. And so when you do the arithmetic, it works out to about a 1,500 square mile, 1,500 square mile cube. Again, I told you I'd go over this ever so quickly, and some of y'all are looking at me with a glazed look on your eye like, I don't get it, what's the point? Well, I told you that as we look at these descriptions, I just think it's trying to tell us it's real beautiful, real big. But some get caught up in saying, well, this is the dimensions and how many people would fit in there, and it gets fanciful. But that's the general description of this new heaven and this new earth. For whatever it is to help you to look at those dimensions or think about those precious metals.
Well, how are they thinking, how many people they will get in there with their souls going to be there?
Well, yeah, thank you, Kurt. If you read the commentaries and people that get fanciful with this, what they'll say is, well, you could fit so many people in there. And Gert said, well, aren't they souls? You know, I mean, because the point that he's making is it really physically bound? Is God boundless or is he bound by physical? He's boundless. And so I think this is a vision kind of like we would, you know, Jeremiah would say, well, Jeremiah, what do you see? And he says, I see a basket of figs. Well, nobody asked, well, what were the dimensions of that basket of figs? Was that really a basket of figs? No, it was a vision. And the point is he's seeing a vision of heaven with bound parameters. It's only meant to show us that it's big and beautiful, and John did what he could to describe it. But some people do get caught up in that, you know, pearly gate and street of gold and those particulars. And again, like I said, if I get there and I see the gates and they're made of pearls and I see that there's a big gold street, I'm not going to be disappointed. But I think that it's a bigger point that's being made. All right, other questions, comments, thoughts before we move on a tad. And I gave you the cliffhanger and I'm going to get to it. Any other questions, thoughts about the new heaven and the new earth, or this description here for what it's worth and what it might offer us?
I have a question.
All right, Tony.
Might be a little, I'm not sure exactly how I'm going to ask.
Oh, it's okay. Yes.
gold and all that. And yet, that's all artificial.
Oh, yeah, it's all physical, yes.
Yeah.
I think it's illustrating a broader point. That it's valuable, that it's precious, that it's beautiful, that it's ornate, that it's awe-inspiring, that you are aghast or amazed at the surroundings. I mean, the average person didn't have a pearly gate. I mean, the average person never went to a city that had a street of gold. The average person didn't have experience with these various precious metals or precious jewels or, sapphires or the like. And all of that was extraordinary. And that's the overarching point. Not that we get caught up in the particulars of those physical dimensions or gates or those particulars. It's describing a beautiful city whose builder and maker is God. That's the overall point.
For me, all I need to do is drive up the Lookout Mountain and look. And
Yeah.
I see God's majesty.
Yeah.
It's beautiful.
Yeah, I think the Grand Canyon is probably prettier and more awe-inspiring than a diamond, to me. And but again, we're dealing with, just Isaiah 40 and verse 18. What are you going to compare heaven to? Well, I guess I'd compare it to the most beautiful, precious, costly, universal. I mean, are diamonds and emeralds and the like a universal? Is there a universal appreciation for a diamond, or is that just an American thing? No, it's pretty universal, right? Around the world, they mine diamonds. There's a diamond market. There's quality and grades of diamonds. Every culture I know of, besides some remote hypothetical group of people stuck in the Amazon somewhere, all appreciate the beauty and, I guess, rarity and preciousness and ornateness of something like a ruby or an emerald or a diamond. That's the point. Yeah. We talked about this when we looked through the book of Revelation. Did he ever use the number 12 elsewhere to be symbolic? Did he use derivatives of 12? Did he talk about the 12 apostles and the 12 tribes? And did we multiply things by 12 several occasions? Yes. Does he mean to be literal? I think no. But I do think people get caught up in these descriptions, and people want to know what. I mean, it goes back to our point that we looked at earlier. We talked about what heaven's going to be like. I never appealed to what it looked like. I said what it's going to be like, right? And I think this appeals to what will it look like. And I think there's some, I don't know, there's some curiosity that surround, I don't know, what it'll be like, obviously, but too, maybe what will it look like? What will the experience be like? And I think that the limited information lends itself to the fact that we could probably not appreciate or understand it to the extent that it would do justice to describing the dwelling place of God in communion and fellowship with God. We just don't have that capability to apprehend, as the psalmist said, it's just too wonderful for me.
Yeah, just kind of feeding off that. I mean, the Word of God is trying to explain in human, physical terms,
Sure.
this very spiritual place and matter.
Yeah.
To what we can grasp and understand. But
Well, it's beautiful, and it's too good to miss. And the next point that we'll make is hell is real. I mean, hell is real, and heaven's too good to miss. I mean, we don't have enough supplied to us to satisfy all our curiosity to precisely what it'll look like or to extrapolate the dimensions. Does that make sense? But yet people get enamored with that. And by that I mean, if you read commentaries or sensational teachers on the book of Revelation, they'll gravitate to these particular passages and create. Okay, if you don't believe me, go to Google and Google models. And people literally make models out of these particular dimensions, and here's what it look like. And it's, I guess you could go to one of these AI things and get it to, draw you a picture of it, right? But, I think that that's a very limited approach to appreciating communing and fellowship with God in His dwelling. I think Nardio was next, and then we'll come back to you, Kurt.
Can we say that whatever is described here is, you use two beautiful words, big and beautiful, right? What do you say? Big, bright, and beautiful. And let's use the word perfection.
Okay. Kurt.
Well, how can AI or anything else describe or
Sure.
draw what it's going to look like?
I meant by using these particulars. In other words, I was really kind of speaking tongue-in-cheek and being facetious and joking. But you could take these particulars, put them into AI, and say, draw me a picture of this, right? Ben, you're going to have to back me up. Ben knows way more about this than I do. You put that in there, and it could draw you a picture with, like Ezekiel's wheels, for instance, in Ezekiel 1. You could put that into AI, and it'll generate a picture for you. I don't know that those efforts or attempts ever do justice to what these individuals saw in a vision. They're only trying to explain it to us in terms we would appreciate and understand. And I'm only just cautioning us from getting too hung up on these particulars and then having at bare minimum, that we don't have a physical view of this spiritual reality, I guess, if that makes sense. All right. Any other questions, comments, thoughts before we move on to the cliffhanger that now we're not going to have near as much time to go over as I thought? If we were in an auction, you just bought something. Fixing my hair. Me too. All right, let's talk about this next one. This was actually brought up as a topic, and I started this series of lessons, and they said, hey, can you touch on and talk about this idea that there will be degrees of reward in heaven and degrees of punishment in hell? And so we'll talk about that. We don't have much time. We won't exhaust the subject. And I hope I can do justice to explaining this idea. What do I mean? What's meant when they ask me this question? Well, it's the idea of what the Bible describes as, in kind of an umbrella statement, rewards or treasures in heaven being personalized or individual. And I think one of the best places to go to have that discussion is 1 Corinthians chapter 3. So turn over your Bible, 1 Corinthians chapter 3. Now, it describes that there's a foundation that's laid. The foundation is laid in what Paul says in Ephesians 2. It was laid by the apostles and the prophets, and Jesus is the chief cornerstone. Okay? And then it's describing in 1 Corinthians 3 that there is this foundation which is Jesus. In other words, He is the foundation, and we build on that. It's akin to the song that we teach our children to sing. The wise man built his house upon the rock, right? And the foolish built his house upon the sand. But both of them are building a house. They're just using different foundations. They both will suffer the storm. The storm is the judgment. And one will stand and one will fall in the judgment. Y'all with me? And so here is a similar description of the judgment and a foundation to build on, and then each of us doing something to build on that. All right, let's read a couple of these verses in 1 Corinthians 3, and we'll go through this notion of, well, what does it mean that we will have degrees of reward? I don't know, maybe I could change the terms. However, this is how the question was posed to me, and it's not the only time it's ever been posed. Are there varying degrees of reward and or varying degrees of punishment eternally? And the short answer is yes. And so let's talk about this on the side of eternal reward, and then we'll talk about eternal punishment and the varying degrees there. And then that'll bridge us into our discussion, the Lord willing, next week on hell. And we'll start looking at that description. All right, so let's look at 1 Corinthians chapter 3. Let's start reading together in verse 5. Who then is Paul and who is Apollos, but ministers through whom you believe? As the Lord gave to each one. I planted, Apollos watered, but God gave the increase. So then neither he who planted is anything, nor he who waters, but God who gave the increase. Now he who plants and he who waters are one. In other words, working together in the same process. And each one will receive his own reward according to his own labor. Is everybody doing the same thing? No. Is everything people are doing warranting a reward? No. And so he's describing this process where we will be rewarded for our own deeds, charitable deeds, good works, things that are recognized. You might think about the scene where Jesus is separating the people like sheep from goat, and he's distinguishing them by their actions. And he said, for I was hungry or thirsty or sick or in prison, and you fed me, or you took me in, or you visited me, or you gave me something to eat or clothes. You did that. And that was this distinction between the two. Of course, you remember their response. When did we see you in those states? And then he said, whenever you did to the least of these, you did to me. Now, with that in mind, will somebody read for us Mark 9 and verse 41?
For whoever gives you a cup of water to drink in my name, because you belong to Christ, assuredly I say to you, he will by no means lose his reward.
Now, if we note the pronouns in there, it's talking about any individual. It's saying he or his. The idea is the individual that does this, he or she, the individual, will not lose their reward. All right? Now, here's one thing I have to say. We're all going to the same place. In other words, what we're presuming in this discussion of varying degrees of reward is of people in heaven. So these are people in that place that we've spent 2 or 3 weeks describing. A place in the presence of God where it's the fullness of joy and where there's perfect peace. But we are describing also that there are various things that we take with us and that will be recognized. Let me say this. They are recognized to the glory of God. They are not recognized to the glory of you. And that's a distinction that's worth mentioning. But I'll talk more about that. Now, here's what I want to do. We have about 2 minutes. But I don't want to leave us in the middle of this discussion. I want to go through and touch the surface of this and then unpack it some more next week. Because he says you'll receive your own reward from your own labor. And then somebody quickly read 2 Corinthians 5 and verse 10.
We must all appear before the judgment seat of Christ, so that each one may be recompensed for his deeds in the body according to what he has done, whether good or bad.
So is there some reckoning in which there is a recognition for the things that you did your whole life, and that if they're good, they will be recognized and rewarded? Okay, so let me ask you a simple question. Does everybody have the same particulars, or are there various circumstances? Okay, let me ask it in a way that everybody will agree. Are you going to be rewarded the same way the Apostle Paul was? Never been in an audience where someone said, yeah, probably. Never. No, everybody always says, nope. Why? What's the answer? You didn't do the same things. Y'all with me? You weren't a chosen vessel in the same way. You weren't given the same opportunities in the same way. You didn't have the same talents in the same way. And when there's a reckoning, it's not going to be the same. Now listen, you have the right to become a child of God, and you can dwell eternally in the same place the Apostle Paul will. But you won't have the same reward. Okay? Does that make sense? And so that's what we're talking about. We're talking about varying degree of reward or recognition. Again, this recognition is to the glory of God. It's not to the glory of Paul. And he'll tell you so, I promise. Now, the other thing that we might mention is we already read these verses earlier. Store up for your neighbor. No. Store up for yourself treasures in heaven. So by your actions that will be judged, you'll store up for yourself treasures. Now, here's what people often say. Well, that's a problem. That's a problem. And what people often appeal to is, it won't be fair, or what if I'm envious? What if my neighbor up in heaven's got more treasures than me? Or what if I look back at my life and say, if I'd have worked harder, tried more, then I could have done more and had more of an influence and not had... Well, if you have those feelings, I'd say it doesn't sound much like heaven. And the other thing is, why would you envy somebody else if envy's not allowed in heaven? And I'll mention this, and we'll have to pick up and talk about this a little bit more. But 1 Corinthians 12 and verse 26, it said, if one member is honored, the rest are envious of him. Thank you, Joanne. If one member is honored, we rejoice with him. We struggle to practice that in a church, don't we? I think we do. We ain't going to struggle to practice that there. All right, we'll have to end. That was the second bell. And I went through that super quick. So next week we'll come back to this slide and go a little slower. And then we'll talk about this degrees of punishment. All right, appreciate your attention.